So before we start taking notes on one-step equations, we're going to talk about what is an inverse operation because those become very important for solving equations. So an inverse operation are operations that undo each other. For example, the inverse of addition is subtracting, and vice versa. Subtracting the inverse is addition. You can think about that with money, like the opposite of adding money to your bank account is subtracting money from your bank account. And then if we think about the inverse of multiplication, it's division, and the inverse of division is multiplication. Those operations also undo one another. So that's going to become important for when we start to solve equations, so just as a little reminder. So if you open up your notes, we're going to start with just the steps of solving one-step equations. So the first thing that you are going to do is identify the variable. So you can stop, take a minute, write down variable in the blank. When we're identifying the variable, I'm going to show you to circle it. The reason that we want to identify it is because when we're solving equations, we're trying to find out what the variable is. So variables are often represented by letters, typically X or Y, but it could be any letter. So that's going to be our first step. Our next step is to isolate the variable. So when we say isolate the variable, we want it to be the only thing on the side of the equation. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the inverse operation, like we talked about in the last slide, to get rid of the number on the same side of the equal mark as the variable. So whatever is on the side of the variable that is not the variable, we want to get rid of, and we're going to use inverse operations. And then the golden rule of math, you'll hear this a lot, is that whatever you do to one side of the equation, you also have to do to the other. So whatever inverse operation we do to the side with the variable, we have to repeat that on the other side of the equation. And then our last step, there's nothing to fill in here, but we're going to check ourselves. So the nice thing about equations is you can actually check if you got the right answer by plugging it back in. So you automatically know if you've gotten the question right or wrong. So the last thing you'll do is substitute your answer in the place of the variable. So those are going to be your steps, and then I'm going to walk you through how you would actually use the steps to solve an equation. So that's the middle of the notes. Now, if you look on the right, you have an addition problem and a subtraction problem. I'm going to walk you through how to do those. So if we start with the addition problem, our first step, again, is to identify the variable. So when we are identifying the variable, we're going to circle it just for the case of this example because we want to realize that that's what we're trying to solve for. The other thing you'll realize I did is I drew a line on the equal side. The reason that I did this is because we're separating both sides of the equation so we can follow that golden rule. So if we look, we have an x on this side of the equation. What we don't want on this side is this plus 2 because we can't figure out what x equals if we have other things on that side. So the way we're going to get rid of the plus 2 is using the inverse of addition, which is subtraction. So we're going to subtract 2 to get rid of this 2. But again, using the golden rule, whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So we're also going to subtract 2 on the other side of the equation or the other side of that line. When we do this, by subtracting 2, it doesn't change the x at all, so we just bring it down. If you were to put 2 minus 2 in your calculator, you'll find that you get 0, which is, you're doing it right because we want whatever that is to go away or become 0. Then, on the other side, we have to actually do 6 minus 2, and 6 minus 2 becomes 4. So really what this means when we have x plus 0, if you were to think about that, that's really just x equals 4. So what we did is we solved for what x is by getting everything away from the x. And as mentioned before, our last step in solving the equation is to check to see if we're right. So we're going to take x equals 4 and check our answer using what we got for x. So if you have the equation x plus 2, now we're going to evaluate that by plugging 4 in. And when we do this, we get 4 plus 2, which is 6, which equals 6 on the other side. So you know that you're doing it right if the whatever you have on one side equals the other side. If we were to get something like 3 and plug it in, we would get 5 equals 6, and that would not be the correct answer because we need to make sure it's matching on both sides. So that's your first example of solving an equation. That's going to be an addition problem. So next I'm going to show you a subtraction problem. So our subtraction problem is x minus 9 equals negative 3. Again, your first step is always going to be to draw the line to make sure you're separating the equation, and then find where your variable is. This slide I'm just going to show you, please do not copy down. I'm going to tell you when to start copying it down. I just wanted to show you why inverse operations are important. So if we were going to use the same method we did in the last slide, you noticed we subtracted 2 from both sides. So I'm going to try that again. I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides to try and get rid of that 9. Again, don't write this down. When you subtract 9 from both sides, we'll follow the same procedure. We bring down the x because it wasn't touched. But now when I do negative 9 minus 9, I actually get a negative 18. And when I do negative 13 minus 21, I get a negative 22. So in the case of this, when I subtracted 9 from both sides, I didn't get rid of what was on the side of the variable. I just made it into a different number, which is not helpful. So the point of this is that if you don't use the inverse operation, you should know right away, because you won't get rid of that number. You'll just change it, and that's not helpful. So I'm going to show you how we actually do this problem. And now you can start writing down what I'm copying. So again, we've already drawn our line and circled our variable. But if you think about minus 9, instead of subtracting 9 from both sides to get rid of that, you actually have to use the inverse, which is plus 9. So if we add 9 to both sides, again, we bring down the x. But when we try and add 9, negative 9 plus 9 becomes 0, which is what we're looking for, because we want that to go away, so we have x by itself. Then when we do negative 13 plus 9, we get negative 4. So it happens that when you do x plus 0, that's just x. So x is equal to negative 4. And our last step that we're going to do is, again, check to see if we're right. So if we are not right, then checking yourself will kind of tell you that right away. And to check your answer, you're taking negative 4 and plugging it into the original equation. So instead of x minus 9 equals negative 3, we're going to try negative 4 minus 9 equals negative 3, which when you put negative 4 minus 9 in your calculator, you will get negative 13, and that becomes a true equation because of both sides of the equal sign have the same number. So overall, that's how you solve one-step equations with addition and subtraction. I'm going to have you try some problems on your own, but the big idea is that you're using the inverse operation to get the variable by itself.